All right. Well, I think I'll make a start, and others can join as I do the introduction. So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Catholic Union webinar with Alasdair Henderson, talking about the Equality and Human Rights Commission. I hope you've all managed to survive this exceptionally hot day, and you're all very welcome. Before I introduce Alasdair, I just want to mention a couple of things. Coming up this Saturday, as many of you will know, is our summer gathering at Oscott, just near Birmingham. The tickets are basically sold out, but if there's one more person who is keen to go, then please do email me or email the office and let me know. The other thing to note for your diaries is our annual Craig Mile lecture, which this year will be on Monday, the 19th of September, in person at the University of Notre Dame in London, our usual venue, featuring Baroness Hollins, one of our vice presidents, who's a member of the Pontifical Council for the Protection of Minors. And her subject will be Protecting Children and Vulnerable Adults, Insights from the Vatican. So please note that 19th of September in your diaries. But without further ado, I'd like now to introduce Alasdair Henderson, and who, as you may have noticed from my description, is a barrister and a commissioner of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. He's going to tell us about his work, the work of the Commission. After his talk, there'll then be an opportunity for questions and answers. If you have a question, can I ask you to use the question and answer function or the chat, preferably the question and answer function, so it's in one place. And we'll finish about 8:30. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Alasdair Henderson to speak to us. Alasdair, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. It is a pleasure to be able to speak to you tonight. I hope you're all coping with this heat wave, and I hope you don't mind that I am just in my shirt sleeves. It was slightly too hot, in fact, really much too hot, to stick on a shirt and tie and be properly distributed for you. So please apologise for that. The plan is for me to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes and then have plenty of time for questions. And as Nigel said, we just use the Q&A function, and we'll try and make sure I cover as much of the questions you've got as possible. In my initial little presentation to you, I was going to try and cover three topics. The first is perhaps the big question, which is why should you care about equality and human rights issues, and what are the current challenges and opportunities in the legal framework and the way that that works in the country at the moment. The second is to talk about what is the Equality and Human Rights Commission, what do we do, who are we, what are our powers, and then thirdly, to talk about the current strategic plan of the EHRC, where are we focusing our effort, and what issues, particularly controversial issues, are we currently grappling with. So let me dive straight in with the question of why should you care? Why should this be a topic that you should be interested in as concerned citizens and as concerned Catholic citizens? Well, I want to give you three big reasons, I hope. The first is that equality and human rights are, I believe, real, true, important concepts. As Christians, and I should say right up front, I'm a Christian, although from a different tradition within the church. I'm not Catholic. As Christians, we have solid, deep foundations for the idea of equal dignity of all human beings, and that all human beings have a set of basic fundamental rights. So the obvious starting point is the key theological concept of the Imago Dei. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 says, we are all made in the image of God, male and female. God created us in his image. And as a result, we have a certain inherent dignity as human beings. Not only that, but the gospel makes clear that all human beings are equally fallen, equally sinful, equally in need of grace, equally redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ. And on top of that, you've got the Old Testament law and the New Testament ethical commands, which set out core principles of the need to protect the weak and the vulnerable. The principle that power is supposed to be to serve and promote justice, not just simply to exercise oppression. Of the key idea of limits on the authority of secular rulers, and so on and so on. And many of these, of course, have been fleshed out in great detail over centuries by Catholic social teaching and in the traditions of other parts of the church. Can I commend to you, in fact, as a little light summer reading, two books which deal with this theme. Neither are actually by Christians, but both make this exact point, that the key ideas of human rights, of equality, of liberalism, really, originate with the Christian tradition. The first is called Inventing the Individual. Sorry, it's probably back to front, I've just realized on the screen, but it's by Larry Siedentop. Excellent book, published a few years ago now. And the second is Dominion by Tom Holland, published just, I think, last year. And both are works of intellectual history, showing that the concepts of equality, equal dignity, and human rights are inherently Christian and have been developed by the church really over the last 2,000 years. So that's the first big thing I want to enthuse you with, is these are real true concepts as far as Christians are concerned. In fact, compared to most other faith traditions or non-faith traditions, philosophical traditions, we have a much stronger basis for believing in these ideas. Our secular friends and colleagues, in particular, find it harder to base what they believe in this in any real foundation. So we should be confident in entering this arena and these kind of issues. The second reason to care about this is because human rights and equality are dominant strands in public discourse at the moment. It's hard to go more than a day or so without seeing arguments about equality issues or human rights in the media, in our political discourse, in arguments over public policy more widely, even in the way that certain things that arise in private sort of situations are talked about. Almost everything is seen through this lens and debated using these ideas and language. So if you want to understand and engage with current politics and current discussions about our society and economy, it really helps to understand the ideas and how they're used. And then thirdly, because I think these ideas, foundational though they are to our current society, are at risk on various fronts. They are at risk from populist political movements, perhaps less so in this country, but still a bit, but certainly in other parts of the world. Populist political movements which don't play by the rules of the game, which treat the rule of law with contempt, or increasingly see these concepts of basic laws on non-discrimination or basic laws on human rights as an overreach, as a restraint on the will of the majority or the mandate of the people. That's the first potential risk. I think that risk is potentially linked, secondly, to the wider societal trends that are happening that are quite worrying. The fallout from the COVID pandemic and the huge impact on society that that's had. The acute economic problems, which have been building up for some time now, but as we all know, are coming to a head in what appears to be a rising cost of living crisis, rising inequality of wealth and income, real pressures on large swathes of the economy. And all of that increases pressure to cut corners on basic rights or non-discrimination in order to deal with immediate crises. But then thirdly, there's also a risk from an intellectual movement which has been variously described by all sorts of commentators as critical theory or wokeism or cultural socialism or illiberal progressivism. You know, I hope, what I mean. It's this constellation of ideas which has given rise to this sort of cancel culture, sometimes described, a sort of you can't say that hectoring ideology that's entered quite a lot of our institutions. Now, we don't have time to dissect that whole phenomenon properly now at all, but I think there are three basic problems with it that mean it's quite problematic. The first is that rather than seeing human beings as fundamentally equal because of their humanity, And other traits like race or religion or sex or sexual orientation or disability, etc., being important but secondary, this constellation or this of ideas or this ideology makes these identities the primary thing. Linked to that, it sees people not as primarily individuals in all their unique, complex, sometimes contradictory mess and glory, but as first and foremost members of identity groups. And then thirdly, it sees equality as a zero-sum game. So not an attempt progressively and incrementally to achieve equality of opportunity for everyone, but the concept of equity, in other words, equality of outcome, which leads to the idea that, well, if you see that some group of people is doing better than some other group of people, then there must be a cause there that's to do with discrimination, and you must intervene to fix that and try and make the outcomes the same. There's kind of a loss of any sense of the common good, that something might just be good for everybody, and instead you have different groups competing against one another for their share of the pie. Now, I think, and I want to suggest to you, that it's in everyone's interest to preserve the ideas of equality and human rights as a basic set of values or rules or principles for our society. And that we should be wanting to resist these pressures that are coming from, I guess you could call the left wing, the right wing, and from general economic and social trends. I think it's vitally important that we don't forget the lessons learned at great cost during the horrors of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, both Nazism and communism. And we keep the strong bulwark against the overpowerful state, which these concepts, particularly human rights, have embedded. But I also think it's probably our best chance as a set of values that we've come up with so far, at least, to hold together a multicultural, multi-faith society in a peaceful, tolerant way. So I hope, therefore, I've persuaded you that you should care about equality and human rights, and that particularly as Catholics and concerned Catholics, you should care because you have a real reason to. Well, the second topic I want to cover then is what is the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and how do we fit into this general discourse on equality and human rights in Britain? Well, we are essentially Britain's equality and human rights regulator. So in the same way as you might think of in terms of broadcast media, Ofcom is the regulator. In terms of various utilities, you've got regulators like Ofwat. In terms of schools, you've got regulators like Ofsted. Essentially, in relation to equality and human rights matters, we are the regulator. We were established by the Equality Act 2006, which was a piece of legislation that brought together, I think as Nigel alluded to, three pre-existing organisations: the Equal Opportunities Commission, which focused on sex discrimination and equal pay, Commission for Racial Equality, which as the name suggested, focused on race discrimination, and the Disability Rights Commission, which again, as the name suggested, focused on disability rights. The 2006 Act brought all of those organisations together, created some new powers, which it gave to the newly named Equality and Human Rights Commission, and also gave the Commission the mandate not just to focus on sex, race and disability, but also, as I'll come to in a minute, on a range of other protected characteristics. We basically have two key roles. The first is to promote and uphold the equality legislation in this country, and that essentially means the Equality Act 2010. That is the act which consolidated all the previous discrimination regulation and legislation into one statute. And our aim in doing that, both prescribed by statute and embedded in the Commission's values, is we aim to ensure everyone in Britain gets a fair chance in life. That's our kind of motto. The second key role we have is that we are what's called a national human rights institution. That means essentially we have responsibilities under the Human Rights Act 1998, which brought into domestic law the European Convention on Human Rights. We have responsibilities under the Human Rights Act 1998 and under international law to maintain and promote human rights protections in England and Wales. And that involves, amongst other things, writing shadow reports to the UN Human Rights Treaty monitoring processes, which take place every year, on the current status of human rights in England and Wales. You'll notice I've been slightly careful about referring to Britain or England and Wales, and not just the UK as a whole. That's for the simple reason that there's a bit of a devolved complexity to this. Northern Ireland has, for various reasons you might be able to guess to do with the Good Friday Agreement, a separate equality and human rights regulator. And Scotland, for reasons related to the Scotland Act, has a separate human rights institution, the Scottish Human Rights Commission, but is covered in relation to equality law by the EHRC, because equality law is actually not a devolved matter, it applies across the UK. So there you go, that's our kind of two key roles. Let me just dig a little bit into how does that actually cash out in practice. Essentially, the vision we try and pursue as an organisation is we want to have a society built on the foundation of equality and human rights, improving everyone's lives and helping people in Britain to live well together on the basis of fairness, equality of opportunity, dignity and respect. The Equality Act 2010 specifically makes it unlawful to discriminate against or harass individuals in a whole range of domains: employment, education, public services, business services, based on 9 protected characteristics. And simply in alphabetical order, they are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage or civil partnership status, pregnancy or maternity, race, religion or belief, sex, and sexual orientation. So that's the law, essentially, that we enforce. We then have the Human Rights Act, which, as I've mentioned already, embeds the European Convention of Human Rights and the full gamut of basic fundamental human rights enshrined in that treaty in UK law. And in order to do our work, we're given, under the Equality Act 2006, a range of regulatory tools. We can do various things, including gathering data and conducting research, and that includes a power to conduct formal inquiries, which thankfully don't tend to take as long as a full-blown judge-led public inquiry, but try and do a similar thing. We've very recently done inquiries on topics like the use of restraint in schools, particularly on neurodiverse children, so children with autism or learning difficulties. We've done an inquiry on the ability of those involved with adult social care to challenge local authority decisions if they don't think they're fair. We've done an inquiry on racial inequalities in health and social care organisations. That came off the back of the COVID pandemic and the apparent evidence of disparities in relation to race in the outcomes of the pandemic. So we can do research. We can carry out investigations. So where we have a suspicion that an organisation has breached the Equality Act in some particularly ongoing or systemic way, we can conduct an investigation. And we can make legally binding recommendations off the back of that if we find, in fact, there has been unlawfulness. The 2 most recent examples of that were the investigation we did into the Labour Party because of the concerns about anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, and also into the BBC because of on-running concerns about equal pay between men and women in the BBC. So we can do research, we can do investigations. We can assess whether organisations are meeting the public sector equality duty under the Equality Act. That's the duty on public authorities and organisations to promote and foster good relations between different protected characteristic groups. We issue compliance notices if we don't think they're doing that. And the most recent example of that was the Home Office, where we looked into whether they'd actually taken into account properly their duty when they were devising the hostile environment policy. And of course, we saw the horrible impact of some of that with the Windrush scandal. So we looked into the Home Office in relation to that. We can produce guidance. So we have a role in producing statutory codes of practice, which actually have to be followed by the courts. There's one on employment, one on provision of services, for instance. We also provide non-statutory guidance, and we can do that on more specific topics. For example, we recently did one on the use of single-sex spaces or services, and to what extent organisations can exclude people of a different sex from a particular service. We can intervene in legal cases. So someone brings a claim that we think is very interesting legally and might have broader ramifications. We can intervene and contribute to the court process and hopefully reaching a good decision that clarifies the law. We can also fund people to bring their own legal claims, and we're currently doing that in relation to racial harassment. We've asked lawyers who are bringing claims on behalf of people in a whole range of areas to get in touch with us if they have interesting claims, and we'll try and fund them if we think they've got wider ramifications again. We can bring judicial review actions, that's challenges against the actions of a government department or public authority for breach of the law. And we can do that in our own right. We don't need to fund someone else. And that's particularly important in enforcing the Human Rights Act. And then finally, we can require organisations to sign a legally binding agreement and then enforce that if it's broken, if we think there's a particular problem that's, again, run on for some time. A recent example of that, just to give you another idea there, is the holiday camp Pontons, who run sort of holiday camps, button-style holiday camps for various families, were refusing people with Gypsy, Roma or Traveller names from coming on their holidays. And we have entered into agreement with that and are now following up to make sure that's implemented. And we try and join all these various powers we've got together. We try to have a regulatory model that essentially tries to identify particular problems early on, prevent them from getting worse, and take remedial action where necessary. Our governance structure, just to give you an idea of that, is that we have a chair, currently Baroness Faulkner, Kishore Faulkner, and we have a board of commissioners, of which I'm one. And essentially, we operate as non-executive directors. So we all have other day jobs, but we attend board meetings roughly every month and try and give a strategic steer to the organisation and accountability over things like the finances, audit and risk, and all the normal things you'd expect from a board in any sector. There are currently 11 of us, and we're actually seeking to appoint a couple of new commissioners soon. So that is a whistle-stop tour of what the HRC is and what it does and what its powers are. Our aim is to be an independent, authoritative, agile regulator. As you may have anticipated, our remit, given that equality and human rights issues can come up in almost every field, is potentially huge. And also the subject matter that we have to deal with is often potentially far more controversial than most regulators. Despite that, we're pretty small. We've only got 200 or so staff and a budget of around 17 million, which I'm sure sounds like a lot of money, but in comparison to other regulators and certainly in comparison to other public authorities or government departments, it's a tiny drop in the bucket. So we cannot do everything, or indeed, for that matter, anything like what everyone would like us to do. And we have a very wide range of stakeholders. So we have to try and be quite strategic. And that brings me on to the third and final topic I was going to cover with you before we open up for questions. And that is our current strategic plan as the HRC, and to give you an idea of some of the topical issues we're currently grappling with. So our current strategic plan, which has just started and will run for a cycle of at least 3 years, focuses on 6 priority areas. As I said before, theoretically, we could get involved in work in almost any field of British society, but we're trying to focus on 6 priority areas where we think there's a particular need. And those are, firstly, equality in a changing workplace. Secondly, equality for children and young people. Thirdly, upholding rights and equality in health and social care. Fourthly, addressing the equality and human rights impact of digital services and artificial intelligence. Fifthly, fostering good relations and promoting respect between different groups. In other words, sort of conflict of rights issues. And sixthly, ensuring an effective legal framework that continues to protect equality and human rights. Our aim with all of that is when we're asked to exercise our powers or intervene in a particular situation, we see whether that request aligns with our strategic priorities. We assess how bad the problem is that's presented itself. And we also assess what's the potential for us actually being able to achieve some successful or wider ranging outcome. So we can't do everything, we try and focus. Let me just take briefly those 6 things in turn, just to give you an idea of why we're interested in them and what kinds of things we're interested in relation to each of those 6 areas. Firstly, the workplace. We are concerned about the gaps in employment rates and pay for different groups. So, for instance, there is still a stubborn gender pay gap between men and women, particularly in some fields. There's also a pretty significant gap between disabled and non-disabled people, and much of that, of course, is related to what roles disabled people can and can't do, but not all of it, and there does seem to be room for trying to reduce that. We're worried about that, and particularly worried about that given the impact of the pandemic and the long-term effects that that might have. We are concerned too that the new trend towards more and more home working, and the trend that there's been for several years now towards an increasing sector of the economy being what's called the gig economy, so short-term, 0 hours contracts, self-employment status for people running multiple jobs or with very little employment rights, whether those trends lead to more discrimination, and if so, what we can do about it. So that's the workplace. Secondly, children and young people. We want schools to be promoting the importance of respect for difference and understanding between different races, faiths, etc., not division. And there are good examples about that out there, but as you may have seen from the media, there have also been some quite bad examples and some quite controversial use of more divisive educational materials in schools, which has attracted the attention of government. So we're keen to try and get involved with that and try and encourage schools to use good materials that really help pupils learn to live well with people who are different from them. We're also very concerned about the effects of the lockdowns and school closures on education, particularly on the effect that they may have had on the most vulnerable. So children from more disadvantaged backgrounds, from broken homes, from certain ethnic groups who seem to be more affected as a result. Thirdly, healthcare and social care. As you may anticipate, that's largely a response to the pandemic and a lot of the problems that's been thrown up. We have been promoting for a long time the right to independent living for disabled people and elderly people, and we really want to see that embedded in public policy. We are concerned about policy and practice relating to the use of detention, isolation and restraint in mental health care. There do seem to be bad examples of that being overused or used wrongly. We're also concerned generally about the extent to which disabled people are accessing healthcare properly and are having their rights respected. We were very troubled, for instance, during the COVID pandemic. It seemed early on in the pandemic that there was a lot of non-individualized, non-specific use of do not resuscitate orders. So people were having do not resuscitate orders put on their medical records without any discussion with them or their family, simply because they fitted a particularly vulnerable category or were listed as severely disabled. That kind of thing is pretty terrible, and we want to try and address that to make sure it doesn't occur. Fourthly, digital and AI. This is obviously a rapidly emerging and moving field. We are very concerned about the design of automated decision making, which is increasingly being used in all kinds of both private sector and increasingly public sector. We're very worried that that doesn't embed discrimination. Often we're finding that algorithms which are being designed to make decisions and are supposed to be entirely unbiased and based on simply a set of merits criteria that have been provided, actually end up either through a process of machine learning or because of the unconscious bias being built into them by the programmers to actually increase discrimination on certain patterns. So we're having a look at that. We're also very interested in the whole issue of protecting people's privacy in an age of big data, of increased surveillance of digital services. And finally, we're interested in ensuring access, equal access to digital services. Older people, disabled people are increasingly being left behind from a lot of services because they are being designed more and more for digital use primarily. And if that is not an easy thing to access, that has an impact on the ability to access the service at all. Two more, fostering good relations. On that, we are trying to encourage a better conversation around the heated topic of trans rights. We are also trying to promote freedom of expression, whilst at the same time promoting its responsible use. And we are trying to promote the use of education and community activities like sports in order to increasingly integrate people of different backgrounds and beliefs in a tolerant and respectful way. This is one of the most challenging areas for us in an age of social media and increasing polarization. We are trying to work out whether we can help. And it's certainly not going to be only our job, but I would welcome any thoughts on that. And then finally, effective legal framework. We have an ongoing concern about access to justice as the courts become backlogged and as funding has been a real stretch for many years. We're also concerned about the maintaining of current protections. We're watching very carefully the changes to the public sector equality duty that are taking place in some of the devolved administrations, and also the Bill of Rights Bill, which has just been introduced in Parliament, which aims to repeal and replace the Human Rights Act. I'll mention more about that in a second. We're also, we've had a big piece of work to develop a human rights tracker, which you can find online, which tracks the UK's responses to UN treaty monitoring and tries to provide a single database setting out what the various UN committees have said about human rights in the UK and how the government has responded. So it's a very easy thing to check and see what the state of play is like at any one time. So that just gives you a sense of the sort of range of things that we're involved with and the range of things we're interested in pushing into in the next 2 or 3 years. Finally, I was going to finish by just touching on a few of the controversial things that have come up recently and tell you where we're at and what we're thinking. I mentioned already we've got the Bill of Rights Bill. The government has just put before Parliament a bill which intends to replace the Human Rights Act. There's some of this we welcome. We welcome the commitment to staying in the European Convention of Human Rights. We welcome the suggestion of having greater protection for jury trial and freedom of speech. But we do have worries about this bill. The primary worry, to be honest, is that it hasn't been done in a way that gets wide cross-party nationwide support and deep-wide consultation. It seems to be being pushed through by the government and not quite in the way that they originally consulted on either. And for such a fundamental piece of legislation, that's a real concern. You want real buy-in and real understanding across the country of that. We're also not convinced that some of the changes being proposed are actually necessary. And we're concerned that they might set up the UK for a potential clash with the European Court of Human Rights, which the government said they're committed to staying in. So that's one to watch. A second major controversial issue that's come up recently, and we've been doing quite a bit of work on, is trans rights for transgender people. We have been trying to encourage people to balance these with the rights of others, especially women. We're not persuaded, for example, that the proposal for self-identification, in other words, removing most of the requirements to get a gender recognition certificate that allows you to be recognised as the opposite sex, that removing most of those and just having it based on a declaration, I am of the opposite sex, we're not persuaded that's a good idea. We are concerned that the Scottish Parliament hasn't yet thought through all the proposals carefully enough and hasn't consulted as widely as it should. We've said that to them. We have tried to make sure that it's clear that the belief in biological sex being innate and unchanging, whether that's on religious or scientific grounds or some other basis, is protected in law. We intervened in the case of Maya Forstater, which you may have seen in the news, to confirm that point. And we're trying to get across the message that trans people deserve dignity and respect and non-discrimination. But that also doesn't mean that there aren't some situations in which the rights of men, and particularly women, to single-sex services or spaces to preserve privacy or dignity or protect the vulnerable are important. And we have published guidance recently to try and explain and clarify that and say to people it is legal to have single-sex, i.e. single biological sex spaces or services where appropriate you can justify it. A couple more to mention. You may have seen in the last year or so, there are proposals to introduce a ban on so-called conversion therapy. This is the idea that you can change somebody's either sexual orientation or gender identity, and that is harmful and shouldn't be allowed. The Commission's position on this, we agree that attempts to medicalise same-sex attraction are ineffective and probably harmful, and you shouldn't try and change someone's sexual orientation through medical or psychological treatment or quasi-religious practices trying to do the same thing. We're not entirely convinced it's a big problem. There do seem to be some cases, but it doesn't seem to be a very big problem now. We are concerned that it's much more complicated for trans people, and that the concept of gender identity is much more contested, and that there is a really important need to ensure that people with gender dysphoria, especially children, can get non-directional counselling that allows them space to desist, to have their gender dysphoria reduce and be happy in their biological sex, rather than affirmative only and pushing them onto the path of transition. We're also concerned that if the government wants to bring in a ban on conversion therapy in relation to both sexual orientation and transgender status, they need to be very careful that that doesn't interfere, with freedom of religion or freedom of speech, including ordinary religious practices to encourage celibacy or chastity outside heterosexual marriage. And it's very important that those basic religious concepts and practices aren't affected by something that's trying to target something quite specifically different. A final example I wanted to talk about was freedom of speech, and in particular the Online Safety Bill, which is currently before Parliament, and who knows what will happen to it given the current Conservative Party leadership campaign. This is another huge, complicated bill, which I can only very briefly touch on, but and we're still developing our thoughts on it as a commission. But essentially, we welcome some parts of this bill. We welcome tougher duties on internet service providers and social media platforms to remove unlawful content. We're in favour of age verification for pornographic websites to protect children. We're in favour of consolidating what's often referred to as hate crime and making it apply to online as well as offline content in the same way. But we are very worried that there might be unintentioned restrictions on freedom of speech from this bill. There is a real concern about the use of duties to remove or reduce lawful but harmful content. And what exactly that means and what amounts to harmful needs to be defined very carefully, unless it's going to have a chilling effect on freedom of expression. So there you go. That is a bit of an idea, the kind of topics we're dealing with. There's a lot going on. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope now we can do some questions. I just wanted to sort of conclude my little initial talk by saying I would really encourage you to get involved with the work of the Commission. We want to engage with the wide range of stakeholders, including religious organisations like the Catholic Union. We're trying to do that better than we have in the past. And in two ways in particular, I'd encourage you to get involved. First is just to engage with our work and engage with consultations when they come up, when we're consulting on a position or a strategic plan in the future. Please write to us, please ask to join our stakeholder relations, mailing lists, groups. Please send us your ideas and your thoughts. The other thing is, if any of you would like to become a commissioner, it's not too late. They are currently looking for 2 new commissioners, and the deadline to apply is this Friday, 22nd of July. So if you have experience in this field, equality and human rights, and experience of being in governance, being a trustee or a board of directors, and you think you'd be interested, please do apply. You can get all the details online, have a look at the public appointments website of government, and take a look. Nigel, I think that's me done. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Alasdair. That was a masterful survey of the background and the work of the EHRC, and I thought those strategic priorities were particularly interesting. And thank you, in addition, for highlighting some of the current controversies, which I'm sure we're all aware of.